Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus went to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from death. They prepared a dinner for him there, which Martha helped serve. Lazarus was one of those who were sitting at the table with Jesus. Then Mary took a whole pint of a very expensive perfume made of pure nard, poured it on Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The sweet smell of the perfume filled the whole house. One of Jesus' disciples, Judas Iscariot, the one who was going to betray him, said, "Why wasn't the perfume sold for 300 silver coins and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He carried the money bag and would help himself from it. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Let her keep what she has for the day of my burial. You will always have poor people with you, but you will not always have me."
I'm always fascinated by any story with Judas in a prominent role, because so much of the way we talk about Judas is our way of trying to understand and contend with evil. He's our ultimate example of how to be a bad person, because unlike the Roman imperial power or the problematic religious leaders, we expect Judas to get it. Judas was one of the disciples. He was there the whole time. He had 3 years of close-up experience of Jesus and still decided to betray him to his death. And that's a fun dilemma to interrogate. What happened in this man's heart that he could see such wonders and wisdom and still decide to sell it out? There's no definitive answer, but I love to see the ways we try to make sense of Judas's decision, which is also why I take a little bit of umbrage with one particular aside from this passage. The little whisper in our ear following Judas's accusation, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. On one hand, I appreciate the picture of a man torn between the material world and the transcendent, who witnesses miracles and still has to worry about his bank account. On the other hand, I feel like this little aside that Judas is stealing money renders a really interesting and complex problem into something simple and dull. Why did Judas betray Jesus? It's because he was greedy. End of story. We've all seen that, and it's just a bit of a flat characterization. It replaces a complex, conflicted antagonist with a cliche, mustache-twirling villain like the cartoons. Now, every gospel writer puts the critique of Mary or another unidentified woman into a different mouth. Mark, never one for a lot of detail, tells us that some of the people grumbled. Matthew improves upon this with some disciples, which also shows a bit of empathy for the question, because it does feel like a sincere, well-meant question. These disciples have been following Jesus around for years and have heard him constantly tell people to sell all their things and give to the poor. So it's an understandable question to ask in this context. Now, Luke changes things around entirely and places the critiques in the mouths of religious leaders, objecting not to the cost, but to Jesus receiving adoration from a woman of ill repute. Only John puts Judas in this position, and it just feels a little silly to do that just to reinforce the classic Judas is evil trope. We've heard that one. But personally, this is the way I think of this story. One of my favorite things from my time at NYU was that every December 8th, which is the date on which John Lennon was murdered, you can go to Strawberry Fields in Central Park, and there will be a huge crowd of people all standing around singing Beatles' song Into the Cold. This was always my favorite part of living in NYC, so this past December, for the first time since moving to Boston, I took a trip back down just so I could visit the park that day. And it was a great time, but in the midst of the singing and the joy and the general good vibes, there were a few people always standing on the sidelines repeating this one same refrain: That's a Paul song. And yeah, you're right. We're here to celebrate and remember John Lennon, and the song we're currently singing was penned by Paul McCartney. You got us. But you're also completely missing the point. This is a group of people gathered to celebrate the unifying power of music by joining together in the same song as one community. And it's one of those little touches of transcendence that we can experience on this earth. And you bring that down just because of a small technicality. Likewise, in this story, Mary is swept up in a moment of transcendence, overcome with relief at having her brother alive again, and the honor to host the man who brought him back. She unknowingly exemplifies the foot-washing servant attitude Jesus will soon encourage his apostles to observe. She's displaying a profound sense of gratitude, and she's brought out an expensive gift to help her express that. But you're missing the point when you reduce that to the price of the nard. You're taking a beautiful and wondrous sight and attempting to shatter it by focusing on the wrong thing. And that's the nature of accusation. It seeks to uphold a sense of purity and rightness, but in doing so, it often tarnishes what little touches we have of goodness and healing and wholeness. We all know there are bad people in the world. We all know that bad people will take advantage of us. We don't need this additional information, and we certainly don't need it when we're in the midst of a beautiful act of service. And in attempting to warn us of the evil that we all know exists in the world, you are depriving us of witnessing the goodness that allows us to endure that evil. I don't mean to say at all that we should just ignore the fact that evil exists and focus on the positive. There's plenty of cruelty and hardness in the world, and we do ourselves no favors by ignoring it. But there is a lot of room between completely ignore evil and point out every single thing that's wrong all the time. It does no one any good to become so fixated on pointing out flaws and hypocrisy that you allow not a single pillar of goodness to stand. As I've said before, the point of grace is to allow us to stop being so preoccupied by our own sin that we're too overwhelmed to take the chance to become better. A nifty side effect of that, though, is that it also allows us to stop being so preoccupied with the sins of others that we miss our opportunities to make the world a little better. Because if all we're seeing in the missteps of others, we risk becoming overwhelmed and anxious and despairing. Grace allows us to see the good in the world worth defending instead of only seeing evils we must correct. Moreover, people who occupy an accusatory stance often enable the harm they cause indirectly by scapegoating those who cause harm more directly. It is easy to stand in front of the camera and scorn those who cause harm through direct violence while ignoring harm caused by the rigid and unforgiving systems we have created. It is easy to pretend that these systems are naturally existing forces which we have no control over, but they're not. And those who enable them to continue are just as culpable in the harm caused as the one who holds the knife. And it is easy for Judas to stand there confident in his correctness, not noticing the harm he has caused by being so hard-hearted and accusatory. It is easy for him to comfort himself that he was right and not see that he's wounded the ego of a faithful woman and ruined a beautiful moment of love and faith. It is easy for him to scapegoat Mary and stand triumphant on his high pedestal of technical correctness, screaming, "That's a Paul song," and basking in his own brilliance. When you start to notice the fallout from this accusatory attitude, you also begin to see how pervasive it is and just how much our society is built around appeasing the accuser instead of defending the good. For example, in my home state of Tennessee, there was legislation passed years ago that required recipients of food stamps to be drug tested. And they discovered that 65 people out of the 39,121 tested were positive for substance use. That's to say about 0.16%. It's also worth noting that the rate of false positives from drugs tests is somewhere between 5 and 10%. They spent $23,000 to discover that actually it turns out not a lot of welfare recipients are using drugs after all. And they wasted all of that money that could have been used to help more people because they were so preoccupied with disproving the goodness of the people being helped. And the longer you spend in the social safety net, the more you realize how much of it is dedicated to not to helping those in need, but to proving that certain people are less in need than they claim to be. We force the poor to prove themselves over and over because we're so obsessed with discovering wrongdoing. Likewise, our poor church has been poisoned by this attitude to the point where we're so obsessed with pointing out the supposed flaws of everyone else that we've neglected to do good ourselves. The early church gained followers through a vision of community, through service to the poor and humility that sees the old class system wiped away for an equality in Christ. The American church is known for denigrating stable, loving relationships because it's assumed that an almighty God of the universe is just so upset that people are falling in love with the same gender. The American church is known for seeing a young woman going through an incredibly difficult moment, making an incredibly difficult decision, and focusing the conversation instead on all the things she supposedly did wrong. The American church is known for being so fixated on the supposed wickedness of everyone outside the church that we've lost what has made us special. We've reduced ourselves to yet another paranoid, self-saving institution because we've been so focused on pointing out the indiscretions of others. And far, far too many in the church have embraced cruelty and heartlessness because they're seen as necessary to protect us from the supposed wickedness of the rest of the world. We've traded in a loving, expansive grace for the ability to sling mud at others and hide behind walls. And this accusation fixation also animates the conversation around our newest societal boogeyman, cancel culture. And don't get the impression that I mean to say we don't have a problem with constantly accusing each other of wrongdoing in an attempt to discredit others, because I think you'll find that I'm in the middle of preaching an entire sermon about exactly that. But for one thing, too many of those decrying the harm done by cancel culture and wokeness are the exact same people who have spent decades trying to cancel queerness altogether by targeting our rights, our employment, any single little thing that brings us joy. Trying to cancel communities of color by forcing them into cramped neighborhoods of poverty and then blaming them for being poor. Trying to cancel those coming from other nations seeking the same opportunities as the rest of us. And such claims just don't hold up under pressure because you can't get upset about being canceled when you've been gleefully canceling the oppressed and marginalized for decades. But beyond that, yes, we have a problem with playing high inquisitor towards each other. But the absolute worst solution to that is to start accusing others of being accusatory, which is what the entire hullabaloo around cancel culture really amounts to. It's people who are upset to face consequences deciding they can get back by accusing their accusers of being accusatory. It's no solution to the problem. It's just another kind of mud they can sling. And it's one of the things that makes all of this so difficult, because even when we try to confront the high inquisitors in our midst, even when we try to point out the ways they harm people by constantly digging to find someone's indiscretions, even when we try to fix the problem, we end up being accusatory ourselves. John himself, in trying to point out Judas's wickedness, places himself in the position of accusing him. You can't devote yourself to calling out these call-outs without rendering yourself a hypocrite. So what can we do then when contending with the Judases and the anti-wokes and the Paul song people, as we'll all have to? I think it's about remembering the things you're defending instead of the people attacking them. Sometimes these things take care of themselves. Those guys on the sidelines constantly screaming about which Beatle wrote which song, in the end, couldn't yell over all the singing, and we all kept having a good time anyway. Sometimes it requires a little more force. When someone like Judas interrupts the party and draws all the attention to themselves, you may have to speak up and remind everyone present about what's really important. Gratitude, community, cherishing our time together because our days are short and no one knows when the last will come. And sometimes the only way to win is not to play. To let the rampant screaming about wokeness and cancel culture just scream to itself while you go find something better to do, maybe something that will actually help anyone. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to this, but the important thing is to keep your focus on what is good, what is life-giving, what is worth defending, instead of getting distracted by those doing the attacking, because attacking and accusing and discrediting are not our purpose on this earth. We're given only a little time, and it's best spent building others up and sincerely enjoying the world that God has gifted us. Sometimes that requires us to defend the things that bring us joy and hope and love. But defense is no one's sole purpose. And those who do the defending must always remember what they are fighting for instead of who they are fighting against. Thank you.